This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, welcome, Bayan. You are representing the Kurdish government in Iraq here in the United States, and I'm very grateful that you've been able to stop by at Cookeville to have this conversation with me. So if you could just start off and tell us, who are the Kurds?
Well, thank you for inviting me to be here. I think you know the answer to that question better than I, since you've written so many books on the Kurds, but I'll try to give you my take on who are the Kurds. The Kurds are a people who have been divided broadly among four countries: Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. We do go back to ancient times. The Medes were the ancestors of the Kurds. And there are mentions of Kurds in the Bible, in history books. The Romans were in Kurdistan. Alexander the Great fought some of his battles in Kurdistan. But today, in modern times, Kurdistan is divided between these four countries: Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria. We speak a common language. We have two main dialects of Kurdish. And at one time, the people who spoke the two dialects perhaps couldn't understand each other. But that's all changed. With the advent of television, everybody, of course, watches television, and there is now Kurdish broadcasting. At one time, of course, it was banned. But now, particularly in Iraqi Kurdistan, we have many TV stations. They broadcast in both dialects. So most Kurds now can communicate in both dialects, or at least understand both dialects. But we have a common language. We have customs that we share. The Kurds are largely Sunni Muslim, but there are also Shia Muslim Kurds, a tiny minority. There are Christians, Yazidis, and many other minorities as well.
So tell me, why is it if the Kurds, about 30 million of them, I think, or maybe even more, why don't they have their own independent state?
Well, after the First World War, according to President Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, there was the concept of self-determination. He introduced the concept of self-determination, and in the post-First World War talks, there was at one time a plan to have an independent Kurdistan in the Middle East. But in the end, the superpowers of the time decided that no, it would be better if the Kurds were divided, and we had a Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, and the Kurds were divided between those countries. And for Kurds, we see this as a historic injustice. Those countries, none of them became democracies. None of them recognized the Kurds. In Iraqi Kurdistan, we have suffered repeated acts of genocide under different Iraqi governments, and most recently under ISIS or Daesh or the Islamic State. In other countries, the Kurdish language has been banned. There have been Kurdish freedom movements that have had armed struggles. And so the history of the Kurds in the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st has not been a happy one. But hopefully we're at the beginning of a change in that trajectory.
Now, you mentioned that the Kurds are largely Sunni Muslim, but you also mentioned that there are Christians living in Kurdistan. So some people feel there's a real problem here between the Kurds and the Christians. Historically, I think there was, but what is the condition now between the Kurds, who are Muslim, and the Assyrian and native Christian groups living in Kurdistan?
In Iraqi Kurdistan, there is a substantial Christian minority Christian by faith, but by ethnicity they are Assyrian, Chaldo-Assyrian, they would call themselves, I guess, or Assyrian. They are the original people of the region. The Assyrian Empire goes back thousands of years, and we're very proud of that history in Iraq and in Kurdistan. The relationship on the whole is very good. We have many Christians who are very active in the government in Kurdistan, in the parliament. 11 of the 111 seats in our parliament are allocated to the minorities, to the Assyrians and to others. Very often we have ministers in our cabinet who are from the minorities. So I would say that they are involved in decision making and in power sharing. Of course, I'm sure there are many Assyrians who would say that's not the case, or our situation is not recognized as much as it should be. And that's a discussion that is always there. But I would say that right now, the vast majority of Christians, Yazidis, and other minorities in Iraq are in Kurdistan. They are there as displaced people. Why? Because they feel safe in Kurdistan. They have run away from the violence in other parts of Iraq since 2003, or more recently, they have run away from the murderous terrorists of ISIS. And so they are in Kurdistan because they feel safe. They are in Kurdistan because they can speak their own language. There are newspapers, TV stations, schools that teach in different languages in Kurdistan. So I would say the situation is generally good, but that doesn't mean that it's perfect or that they're as satisfied as we would like them to be.
So actually, one could argue that the Kurds largely protect the Christian minorities who have come into Kurdistan for protection from some of these waves of terrorism sweeping the Middle East right now.
Yes, absolutely. It's not a coincidence that people fleeing different parts of Iraq have come to Kurdistan. Today, not only is Kurdistan sheltering the vast majority of Christians, Assyrians, Chaldeans in Iraq, but also Yazidis, Turkmen, Shabaks, Karkis, but also we are sheltering about 1 million Arabs who have fled the violence in Iraq. So Kurdistan has become a safe haven for anybody who feels persecuted elsewhere in Iraq. And I think this is something that the United States, the people of America, should recognize and nurture and support. I hear all the time from Americans that we support different governments, different entities in the Middle East, but they don't appreciate us. Well, actually in Kurdistan, we do appreciate the United States, but the United States needs to support entities like the Kurdistan Regional Government or the Kurdistan region that respect people of other ethnicities, other faiths, not only respect them, but protect them, and are protecting them with their own lives.
So why is it that you're having some trouble with the United States now? For example, all Kurds would like to become independent, and they certainly deserve independence, yet the United States opposes Kurdish independence. Why is that?
We're not expecting anyone to give us independence on a plate. We have to fight for it, and by fight I don't mean necessarily physically engage in a war. By that I mean we have to struggle, we have to engage in nation building, we have to prove that we can be a competent government, we have to prove that we can protect our people. I would argue that the state of Iraq is a failed state. It has failed repeatedly to protect its own people. Not only that, it has attacked its own people, but even more recently, the Iraqi government has failed to protect the people of Iraq. We in Kurdistan region have had issues, for example, with not enough weapons, with not the right weapons to protect our people. But when we've had the weapons, when we've had the support, we have and we are protecting our people. We are protecting others who have come to Kurdistan, and we're doing our best to continue to be a competent government, a functioning government, despite all the huge burdens and responsibilities that we have today.
Well, so why is it the United States doesn't see this and opposes Kurdish independence and wants to keep Iraq together? Where's the United States going wrong on this?
Well, with respect, I think that's a question for the State Department. But what we hear from our friends in the State Department, in the White House, is that the United States believes in a one Iraq policy, that both Iraq and Kurdistan are stronger together. I believe that is a very laudable sentiment, but it doesn't really reflect the facts on the ground. It reflects the facts as the United States would like them to be, but not as they are. The fact is that today, the Iraqi government helps us very little. Kurdistan receives very little, if any, military assistance from Baghdad. Our Peshmerga are not getting any money from Baghdad. Our budget has been suspended by Baghdad. And the 1.8 million displaced Iraqis and Syrian refugees that have taken shelter in Kurdistan are getting very, very little, tiny amounts of assistance from the Iraqi government. So the facts on the ground are that Iraq has very little to do with Kurdistan. What we see from Baghdad is punishment and an attempt to control. We don't see protection, we don't see nurturing, we don't see an embracing of Kurdistan. I'll give you an example. As I'm sure you can tell from my accent, I grew up in Britain and I was the representative of the Kurdistan regional government to the UK. In 2014, the people of Scotland held a referendum on independence. And the pro-independence campaign was called the Yes campaign, Yes to Independence. The No campaign didn't call itself the No campaign. It called itself We Are Better Together. To me, as a Kurd, that was such a warm, embracing way for the rest of Britain to say to the people of Scotland, you're part of our family. We don't want you to leave. And these are actually the words that the Prime Minister of Britain used. He didn't use threats. He didn't use tanks. He and the leader of the opposition in Britain went to Scotland and pleaded with the people of Scotland, put out all the economic arguments and other policy arguments forward. But really, they were pleading with the people of Scotland to stay as part of Britain because we were better together. Do we ever hear that kind of language from Baghdad? No. We hear resentment, we hear threats. We are seen as a thorn in the side of Baghdad. We, and particularly the young generation of Kurds in Iraq, feel that the rest of Iraq doesn't want us. So why on earth should we stay with Iraq?
And I would add to that, the United States argument is that keeping you in Iraq stabilizes the peace in the Middle East and leads to a greater chance for peace. It seems to me the opposite is true. By forcing you to live in a house that you don't want to live in with leaders who have been guilty of genocide, the Anfal campaign at the end of the Iran-Iraq war, this is contributing to instability in war. And it has just always amazed me that the U.S. government just doesn't see this and continues its policy. But now that you're here in the United States, let me ask you something different. You've been here as the Kurdish ambassador for over a year. What are your impressions of the United States, and also specifically Tennessee? I understand you've been here before. What are your impressions of the U.S. and Tennessee?
It's been very striking to me that there is a great deal of goodwill among the American people towards Kurdistan. I came to the United States in February 2015, and it was around the time of the siege of Kobani. If you remember, ISIS or Daesh in Syria had encircled Kobani, and really the people of Kobani heroically resisted the siege, and eventually, with the help of airstrikes from the United States and other coalition partners, were able to fight back. The Peshmerga from Iraqi Kurdistan also went to Kobani and fought against ISIS and liberated the city. And I think that heroic siege and resistance of the Kurds the fact that the Peshmerga are willing to fight, and America finds it very hard to find partners in the Middle East who will fight. We are willing to defend our people and to defend the values that the people in the United States believe in as well. So I see a great deal of goodwill from the American people towards the Peshmerga, towards the people of Kurdistan.
And who are the Peshmerga?
The Peshmerga are the military or the soldiers of the Kurdistan region in Iraq. But really the Peshmerga, the word actually means those who face death. The Peshmerga have been the freedom fighters for Kurdistan. My father was a Peshmerga in the 60s.
Right. Tell us briefly, what happened to your father? He was killed in a terrorist strike.
Yes, in February 2004, my father, my elder brother Salah, and many other people were killed in a suicide attack by Islamist extremists who, it was a group that was linked to Al-Qaeda. But my father was in the freedom movement. He was a veteran of the Kurdish liberation movement, along with many others. And people like him took up arms against the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein, and they were known as the Peshmerga, those who would face death. And then after 1991, in Iraqi Kurdistan, we had protection from the United States and other coalition partners. During that protection period, we were able to hold elections in Kurdistan and Iraq for the first time. Out of the elections, we created the Kurdistan Parliament, the Kurdistan Regional Government, and the Peshmerga as the official army of the Kurdistan region. And since then, the Peshmerga have been recognized in the Iraqi constitution. So that's who the Peshmerga are.
Now you've touched on the Kobani siege in Syria. Could you tell us briefly one of the greatest problems the Kurds have had over the years, divisions among the Kurds? So you're representing the Iraqi Kurds, but there are a much larger group of Kurds in Turkey, the PKK in Turkey, now the Syrian Kurds, and also the Iranian Kurds. And why is it that the Kurds have had so many problems over the years being divided and even letting their enemies, the Turks and the Arabs and the Iranians and practically everybody else, the Kurds have no friends but the mountains, use these divisions among the Kurds to divide and rule the Kurds?
I think that's absolutely right. Our enemies use our divisions, and unfortunately there have been times when we've allowed them to use these divisions. I think as a Kurd, we often have a duality to our identities. So for example, I'm an Iraqi Kurd. Why? Because I was born in Iraq and my parents were born in Iraq. But actually I have many relatives in Syria. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother was from Syria, and Sinjar, where I'm from, in Iraq, is on the Syrian border. I have many relatives in Turkey, and my husband is an Iranian Kurd. So as a family, I don't think of my husband as Iranian. I think of him as a Kurd from Mahabad. He thinks of me as a Kurd from Shingal or Sinjar. So we have this identity that is pan-Kurdish, and we are linked by blood, and we are linked by history, by custom, by language, and by suffering. And then we have the other part of our identity, which is the fact that since the beginning of the 20th century, we have been divided between 4 countries. These borders, on the one hand, don't exist because we are all Kurds, we're linked by blood. On the other hand, they do exist. And the Kurdish movement in these 4 different countries has evolved differently because Turkey as a country has a different character from Iran. Iran used to be a very liberal Western type country under the Shah, and now it's a very Shia Islamist republic. Turkey has a different character from Syria, from Iran, from Iraq. So the Kurdish movement in those countries has developed and evolved in a different way. So there are those divisions, if you like, or those realities. But I would say the other difference is that sometimes it's ideological. You mentioned the PKK, which is a Marxist, very ultra left-wing, I would say quite authoritarian organization. They would say they have what they call I think they call it a local autonomy.
Democratic autonomy.
Democratic autonomy, I would call it something else. But anyway, ideologically, I have a difference of opinion from them. I prefer the kind of democracy that we have in Iraqi Kurdistan and that we're striving for in Iraqi Kurdistan. That's just an ideological difference.
Could you tell us briefly the role of women in the Kurdish world? Because we know that in the Middle East, women still have many problems with equality and being treated fairly. And what have been your experiences as a female Kurdish leader?
It's definitely true to say that in Iraqi Kurdistan, we don't have equality for women. I think it would be very far-fetched for me to say that we did. But what we do have is greater opportunities for women in Kurdistan than I would say in the vast majority of places in the Middle East. In Kurdistan, we can choose whether we want to be veiled or not veiled. In Kurdistan, we can have careers in government, in politics, in business, in the civic society, or in civil society. We have a quota for female members of parliament. 30% of MPs have to be women. And this has forced the political parties in Iraqi Kurdistan to look for women who are capable and to educate and nurture them and give them training in policy development, in speaking to the media. This wouldn't happen, frankly, without the quota system. I know quotas are controversial, but in my opinion, in societies in the Middle East, you need to have quotas. Otherwise, you won't get anywhere. So in Kurdistan, I think women have a much, much more prominent role in society. And on issues of equality, equal opportunity, on gender-based violence, honor-based violence, we are very open about this. We talk about it. We're trying to combat this. We have speeches by the Prime Minister against violence against women. And this kind of initiative is something that is rarely seen in the Middle East. I'm a representative of the Kurdistan regional government in the United States. I'm in the leadership of one of the parties, the KDP. This hasn't happened by chance. There has been a decision to promote women like me and others to those kinds of positions. But I would say there are many, many opportunities for women, but that doesn't mean that we're Sweden or Switzerland or the United States. I want to be realistic about that.
Well, as a woman, do you find that men listen to you when you're the ambassador here? Do they take orders as they're supposed to, or do you have to discipline them, these men, sometimes?
I have worked since the late 80s, okay? I have worked as a journalist. I worked as a journalist in Britain and in Japan for 17 years, and now I'm in my 11th, 12th year working for the Kurdistan regional government. So I have a lot of work experience behind me. I have worked in situations where it's been a very male environment and I've been the only woman or almost the only woman. I've worked in opposite environments where it's been almost all women with one or two men. And I've worked in situations where it's a balance. So I've worked in all of these environments, and honestly, hand on heart, whether you're talking about a Kurdish environment or a European Western environment, the best atmosphere to work in is when there's a balance, a gender balance in the workplace. Then the team works better together, you get more ideas, you get different balance of talents. And so this is really what I strive to do. And right now the team that we have in Washington at our representation, I would say, is a very good mix of male, female, and we work as a team.
And do you have the different Kurdish parties represented in your office?
Yes, not every party. We're not such a huge office, but yes, the main parties we have.
And finally, I was going to ask you briefly, what are the main problems that your government is having right now?
Right now, we are facing three major shocks. First, ISIS, which turned up in 2014, and therefore we're engaged in an expensive war. By expensive, I mean we have lost 1,600 Peshmerga, we have 7,000 injured, and we have the genocide against the Yazidis and the Christians. So we're fighting a very costly war. At the same time, we have this humanitarian crisis. 54% of the displaced and refugee community in Iraq is in Kurdistan in Iraq, 54%. But we don't have 54% of the budget to deal with it. Then we have the fall in oil prices, which has really hit our economy. So all of these things together have really made our situation in Kurdistan very, very desperate. And this is why we're asking the United States and other coalition partners to look at how they can help our economy so that we can continue to fight ISIS and not let them defeat us through the economy when they couldn't defeat us militarily.
Isn't oil a big problem, though? You're so dependent on oil exports, and maybe you need more diversification of the economy?
Absolutely, we do, and this is something that we recognize. And our Prime Minister has started a reform program. There are austerity measures and a reform program. And actually, we're reaching out to organizations like the World Bank to help us implement the reform program so that it's not just talk, but actual implementation.
Well, great. I wish we had more time here. And so let's just say next time you come to Cookeville, we'll pick up from here and go on.
I would love to. Thank you.
Thank you.
This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.